Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt. As we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, we now turn to a little poem called Out from Behind the Mask. This is poem number 13 of the 38 of Autumn Rivulets. You'll recall that we said that this title, Autumn Rivulets, the autumn will obviously designate that which is kind of old, and the rivulets, that which is new, and to some degree we're going to ask why specifically this poem would end up in Autumn Rivulets. Now, some have called this that this is the poem of Whitman at his most mature and attractive, end quote. A scholar has said this about this poem. So some people consider this one of the most amazing poems of them all. Now, we have already commented a little bit on Whitman and photography. He was very much into it. Just Google really quickly images of Walt Whitman and just be blown away by all of the different images that are available. We obviously wish that we had more. And for all of us, and I'll ask this at 3B when we finish, all of us have kind of our favorite image of Whitman. For me, one of my favorites is the one that he took with fake butterfly to try and show just how he was so in tune with nature. It's a wonderful image, and it's one of my favorites. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt is our playlist. And you've been with us from the very beginning of inscriptions all the way up to and including a set of introductory comments for Autumn Rivulets. And then, of course, we just finished with the Peabody poem, Outline for a Tomb. Now, our Nortons will give us some very important background information here. Told that Nortons will tell us this poem was first published in the New York Tribune, February 19th, 1876. Then in Two Rivulets of 1876, a companion volume to Leaves of Grass, and in Whitman's centennial edition of Leaves of Grass in that year. The poem was Whitman's description of a portrait in Leaves of Grass 1876 facing the wound dresser, a poem that obviously we've already finished with. I printed a copy of this just so that you could see it here. Okay. It's one of my favorite images of Whitman, and Whitman himself said that this was one of his favorite images. It's actually an engraving from a portrait. This portrait actually was not present in the 1892 edition. Norton's continues. Here reproduced, was printed from a handsome engraving on wood by W.J. Linton of a photograph of the poet made by G.C. Potter in Washington in 1871. It was to his poetic self-portrait that Whitman referred, not to the artist's engraving, in a preview that he wrote appearing in the New York Daily Tribune of February 19, 1876, quote, Whitman gives his own portrait from life in a book, a large, bending, gray-haired man looking at you. There has been a whole lot that has been written about this, and to that degree, when we meet the line burned eyes, we'll want to point out that this is actually a technical term meaning cut by the burn as an engraver's tool. Now, as we turn to this poem, I want to just take us back really quickly to Song of the Open Road, a text that we've already exegeted entirely. But I want to take us to passage number 13. Do you remember when he said it this way? Whoever you are, come forth, or man or woman, come forth. You must not stay sleeping and dallying there in the house, though you built it or though it's been built for you. Out of the dark confinement, out from behind the screen. It is useless to protest. I know all and expose it. Now, as we commented in earlier discussions of Leaves of Grass, especially in Song of Myself, borrowing from the great Harold Bloom and his comments about Song of Myself, Whitman is always making promises about what he's going to disclose or tell us about himself, and of course, he rarely, if ever, actually gives us much information. Now, in this poem, we'll be playing a game where he's looking at a picture of himself, and he's going to call this poem Out from Behind This Mask. Now, the word this gets used 14 times in this poem, so we want to pay particular attention to that word. By the way, the word mask, you'll maybe remember, was used in Scented Herbage of My Breast, Song of the Universal number 2, How Solemn. I mean, we've seen this idea of the mask, and of course, this will take us back to the ancient Greek tradition. I think to read this poem, you have to appreciate the ancient Greek play, dramatic theater that would happen for the Greeks. For example, we're playing around at to be, you can write this down already, with a certain kind of hexameter, that is to say this kind of 6-part rhythm, and of course, we've commented on this at LearnStrong.net already, elsewhere, the Iliad and the Aeneid are of course going to play the exact same game. Now notice this is a 2-part poem, and notice the subtitle is To Confront a Portrait, the first part. Out from behind this bending, rough-cut mask. Now, the word rough cut, or the phrase rough cut, gets used one time in all of Leaves of Grass, and it's right here. These lights and shades, this drama of the whole. Now, the use of the word drama takes us back to Song of the Redwood Tree, Part 2. And the idea of drama, we're going to come back to it here in a little bit with the word plays. The idea of drama, and there's been a lot that's been written about how Whitman loved the idea that poetry could be utilized in almost dramatic fashion. And so he, obviously playing the game here, he continues, this common curtain of the face, and of course to use the word curtain will take us back to drama, of the face, contained in me, for me, but then he says it, in you, for you, in each for each. I mean, it takes us back to Song of Myself, passage 1, right? And that, I celebrate myself and sing myself, for every atom belonging to me as well belongs to you. In other words, the inclusivity of Whitman. Now, what's he doing? Well, he's looking at a picture of himself, and he's going to argue, it's not really me. But let me step out from behind the mask and tell you who I really am. Notice, in parenthetics now, he'll play the game with the word tragedies, right? Which, again, takes us back to the Greek tradition. And we've given lots of lectures, of course, of Aristotelian poetics and all of the great Greek dramas and tragedies on LearnStrong.net if you want to go back and refresh your memory there. Tragedies, sorrows, laughter, tears, and then the dash, oh heaven, which is only used one time in all Leaves of Grass, and it's here. The passionate, teeming plays this curtain hid. Now, it's interesting that it's hid, not hides, right? And the idea that he's already commented on drama, and now here we are with plays. And the fact that he uses the word teeming, and we saw that for the first time with Eidolons, right? This glaze of God's serenest, purest sky. You'll maybe remember this word glaze. Again, these echoes are amazing. This from When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloom, passage 11. This glaze of God's serenest, bluest sky. Now we're going to come back after vocalism. We're going to meet to him that was crucified, and we're going to talk about his use of the word God. And in the next line, his use of the word Satan obviously takes us to Milton and Paradise Lost. Serenest, purest sky. This film of, and again, the fact that he's talking about photography, he used the word film. This film of Satan's seething pit. By the way, when we get to chanting the square deific, especially passage 3, we're going to come back to this idea of his use of Satan. It's very, very rare that he uses the word Satan in Leaves of Grass. And to that degree, we'll have to comment on it maybe even later, right? But obviously the influence of Milton is clear. This Heart's Geography's map. Again, in some ways you could argue that if, Ken Wilber is the great integralist thinker in creating this cartography of human spirit, clearly Whitman was in many ways going to precede him, and here he'll play this game with the word map. This, notice, limitless small continent. It's so much fun that the way he puts these words together, limitless and small. By the way, you'll remember limitless from I Know I Have the Best of Time and Space and Was Never Measured and Never Will Be Measured from Song of Myself 46, same game. This soundless sea, and obviously Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking comes to mind, as does any number of other poems where the sea is being mentioned. Out from the convolutions of this globe, in other words, in some real strange way, you, just like Whitman will say of himself, you're a globe, you're an entity unto yourself. This subtler astronomic orb than sun or moon, than Jupiter, Venus, Mars, obviously during Whitman's lifetime, all of the study of astronomy and the planets was starting to become such part of the natural parlance of the day. And yet, notice he's going to say that the most interesting planet is not Jupiter or Venus or Mars. It's actually you. This condensation of the universe. It's interesting to me that he uses the word condensation because it has a lot of buried in it, no pun intended, the idea of growth, right? Seed growth, like Germanic in some ways, Germanism and all of that. This condensation of the universe, and then again in parenthetics, nay, here the only universe, here the idea, obviously playing around with this Hegel, all in this mystic handful wrapped. And then again, the parenthetic again to end it. In other words, we can look out and we can see, as we saw with learned astronomer, we can see the stars. But there's something mystical, and I mentioned obviously learned astronomer for that reason. There's something mystical about this. And then we're to the line that Norton's talked to us about, these burned eyes flashing, and then for the first time, to you, to pass to future time. This is interesting, the idea of legacy, but it's also interesting the way, again, as we've commented so many times from Brooklyn Ferry and elsewhere, the way in which Whitman has this amazing ability to reach from the text and directly come to you, to the reader. This ability to be so personal as he plays this game. These burned eyes flashing to you to pass to future time, to launch and spin, again the globe comes to mind, through space revolving sidelong, from these to emanate, again more condensation, kind of the growing language, to you, whoever you are, and then the dash, and then a look. Now, this phrase, a look, we will have seen, by the way, to launch and spin is used only one time in Leaves of Grass, and it's right here. I find that interesting. A look, you'll remember this from a Song for Occupations, passage 5. You'll also remember it in powerfully Vigil Strange, a look I shall not soon forget. In other words, he's talking about the look that he is giving through this photo, and yet, in some interesting ways, he's challenging the reader to look at him. In other words, look at me, see me. And then now passage 2 to finish. And this is some of the most amazing melodic poetry, right? A traveler of thoughts and years of peace and war. In a minute he uses the word traveler. We're thinking about Song of the Open Road. We're thinking about Song of Myself, passage 14 with traveler. Of course, we're thinking about Odysseus, no question. A traveler of thoughts and years of peace and war. I find it interesting that he uses peace and war here. This is his only use. 4 other times in Leaves of Grass, he'll say war and peace, and obviously we think of Tolstoy's classic novel. But here it's peace and war. I think, as I've said to you, I think Whitman's having great fun in Leaves of Grass, and this is one of those moments when he reverses the order, peace and war. Of youth, obviously we think about the earlier poem of Autumn Rivulets, A Child Went Forth. Of youth long sped and middle age declining, and now all of a sudden we'll begin to realize why this poem is in Autumn Rivulets. And then again in parenthetics, as the first volume of a tale perused and laid away, and this the second song's ventures, speculations, presently to close, in parenthetics. It's almost as if Whitman is recognizing in Leaves of Grass, as the deathbed edition that we are now studying together, that he's coming to the end. And in fact, we are, right? We're not that far away from the end of Leaves of Grass now. And then he uses this word lingering, and you'll remember this from As I Pondered in Silence. Lingering a moment here and now, to you, I opposite turn. It's so cool. It's like, okay, you're looking at a picture of yourself and you're writing this poem to some reader that's going to, come along 200 years later. We'll say it that way. And it's like Leaves of Grass is almost like the other portrait, the portrait that really matters, the one that you're looking into, like a mirror, we might even say, right? I opposite turn. And then he uses an interesting simile that will take us back to Song of the Open Road. As on the road, or at some crevice door by chance, or opened window, pausing, inclining. Now, this is the only time inclining gets used in all of Leaves of Grass, but it does take us back to Song of Myself 3 and 5. Inclining, bearing my head. We think about headgear, but now we're thinking about, obviously, there's some very, very kind of almost like erotic language here. Bearing my head, you specially I greet. This is like a welcome poem of a kind, right? To draw and clench your soul. I told you guys when we started, his idea of wrestling and grabbing and holding and hugging, and now here it's clenching, of course, from Pent Up Aching Rivers, the bending curve and clench. You'll remember that. Clench your soul for once inseparably with mine. This bearing my head, by the way, bearing only gets used one time in all Leaves of Grass. It's there. In other words, it's like I'm bearing my soul to you, to only you, inseparably with mine. In other words, if you read Leaves of Grass well, you somehow become intertwined, to use now the language of earlier poems. You become intertwined with Whitman. You start to see the world through Whitman's eyes, and I think that's a whole lot of what Whitman wants in his Leaves of Grass, and certainly in this poem. And then he finishes with then travel, and he stacks, as we've seen it so regularly, he loves to do this, travel on. In other words, pause for a moment, take a look at the image, and then move on. In the same way that he will recommend, pause for a moment, take a look at a poem like this, and then move on. Which is why we elected to call this set of discussions Talks with Walt. Just meet him for a little bit. That's all you got to do. But over time, you're going to come back again and again and again. All right, how are we going to finish with a poem like this at 2A, Messages, Themes? Well, I think he's arguing that great art is always somehow symbiotic. That is to say, there's always going to be the reader and the poet, and yet somehow they travel together, right? At 2B, I love that this keeps being repeated, this over and over again. And I love to hear the hexameter rhythms of this, the rhythms of classical epic, actually, okay? So go back and read this again. Like when you take your walk to the park, and especially if you have children, just read it out loud and just hear the melodic beauty of this poem. At 3A, well, obviously, you got to mention all the classics. I think he's drawing heavily on the classics in this poem. That is to say, autumn rivulets. In other words, from the ancient classics are derived a poem like, a set of poems, a book of poems like Leaves of Grass. The Iliad, the Aeneid come to mind. I think as well, though, we have to remind ourselves that Paradise Lost, Milton's Paradise Lost, is also very, very influential in the thinking of Whitman, as I've said so many times in earlier lectures. And again, at LearnStrong.net, I've given full lectures on all of the books of the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and of course our Dante, which could come to mind here as well as Milton and Paradise Lost. I would also say at 3A, go and study all of the different images of Whitman. You decide which one of those images you like the best. Of course, he put an image of himself with his hat kind of half-cocked and his shirt half undone in the very first 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass, as we talked about before, without any kind of name even on the front. It was such a casual image, and yet such a beautiful, beautiful image. And of course, that leads us to 3B and the question, which is your favorite image of Whitman, right? I usually argue that my favorite image of Whitman is the one I'm looking at the time. You can decide which one is for you your favorite. And now to try and own this poem, what's your favorite image of yourself? Some of us don't like pictures of ourselves. We don't like looking at pictures of ourselves. Others of us are like, well, you know, you learn a lot when you look at a picture of yourself, especially when it's younger. But what is your favorite image of yourself and why? And does any photo, just to finish, does any photo of you ever really show and capture the true you? And is it possible that maybe the mask is something we never really could get behind for Whitman? Thank you.